I joined when I was, I think, about 26. And I'd like to say I had a long-standing ambition to be a broadcaster or in the BBC, but that wasn't the case at all, really. When I was at university, I was very aware of friends of mine who were going into the BBC as trainees, but they were people who'd had a lot of activity in student theatre, and they seemed to have different attributes to those that were mine. The first job I had was as a graduate trainee in the Atomic Energy Authority. At that time, there was a fashion for having graduates going into industry. Yeah. And the Atomic Energy Authority, seeing young people going into the Treasury and the other branches of the civil service, set out to do the same thing. So they recruited a few people to do that.
Yeah.
So I was up in the north of England, quite enjoying it, but not enormously. And I was taken aback that somebody who was a trainee like me, but a couple of years ahead of me, suddenly announced he was going to work at the BBC. And some month or perhaps a year later, I saw an advertisement for administrative trainees in the BBC. I applied and succeeded. So I found myself in the BBC. I was assigned to work in the appointments department. And you know how that works. The BBC advertises almost every post. So in a way, you can apply for anything within it. Well, I was given two sorts of assignment. One was interviewing young third-year undergraduates who wanted to join the BBC in the graduate trainee scheme. And the other was chairing appointment boards, mainly in the production areas. Some of that was in a way ridiculous because you find yourself chairing boards of people where the other people on the boards were, immeasurably senior to you. I chaired a board where sitting next to me on one side was Grace Wyndham Goldie and sitting next to me on the other was Alistair Milne. My voice was theoretically carrying the same weight in the judgment as theirs, which of course it wasn't. And I did quite a bit of that in a concentrated period.
You must have had natural authority.
I think I had natural discretion or the ability to fade into the background or not get on their nerves to the point that they told me to actually clear off. But anyway, I did it to the appointments department's satisfaction for a bit. In one way, it was a terrible job because seldom did your voice have a great deal of weight. In another way, it was good, more selfishly, because it took you all over the BBC. I mean, I did boards for Gaelic producers in Scotland and religious producers in Wales, and I mean, you've got a real sense of the entirety of the BBC and its complexity. But what it did for me psychologically was perhaps in a way more important still, because doing these boards and seeing who got appointed to what, you couldn't help in the end comparing yourself to those appointees. And it became pretty clear to me that the people being appointed to junior posts in radio and television production weren't, vastly more gifted, articulate or effective than I believed myself to be. I mean, that was a revelation to me.
Yeah.
And so we're in the middle 60s, so BBC Two is just starting up. And at that point, of course, it needs a lot of recruitment. And there was a lot of movement from other parts of the BBC into BBC Two, or the production departments that would service BBC Two. So when a new department was launched, the further education department in the middle 60s, I was on the board for interviewing people for that and seeing who was being appointed. I think I've got a good acclaim to this as these guys. So I became a candidate and thus entered BBC Television.
Into further education
Yes,
television?
yes.
Yeah, I see.
But I suppose at the outset in that department, perhaps half the people had already been in the BBC and indeed in television production, and the other were neophytes like me.
So were you at Villiers House?
No. So when that department began, we had offices, different production teams had offices in those buildings that abutted Shepherd's Bush Green. Was it Threshold House or yes. Union House? But different teams were in different places. And I can remember that the second production I was on, which was one that Sheila Innes produced, we were in the Langham. It was around, 68, 69 that the BBC took on Villiers House, and together with BBC Enterprises, educational television relocated there.
So you had enterprises, schools and further education. Now, were the advisory councils set up at about that time?
I don't know when they were set up. They were in existence, certainly, although they didn't, as a young assistant producer, they weren't on my horizon, really. That was a level of, that was above my pay grade, as it were, the more strategic discussions that were going on there. Certainly, by 1969, I was very aware of the education officers, as it were, the field force of liaison people that the BBC had set up to offer quasi-independent advice to the BBC on what it should be doing and to gather feedback on the effectiveness of what it was doing.
So the BBC was really beginning to build up an educational remit wider than the old Reithian remit. I mean, organised education, effectively.
Yes. Well, they were, certainly by the end of the 60s, there was an effective, well, I'm going to call it field force for want of a better word, but they had a person situated in most regions of the country who were in touch with local education authorities and with almost any entity in society that they could find, really, to gather feedback, both as to what the BBC could and should do, and to supply unvarnished feedback as to the effectiveness of what it was doing.
Now, we have to bear in mind that the further education, or continuing education as it became, department was not labelled as such on air, whereas schools, of course, was labelled as schools television. So we were producing what you might call general output, but targeted. Did you consider yourself part of a Cinderella department? In other words, the transmission times were always at the extreme edge of the schedule, beginning or the end.
Yes, so I think there was that feeling, certainly. Yes, as you say, there were set transmission times, often on a Sunday morning or late at night, perhaps, which we all felt were less than ideal, and also I think the access to resources and staff was felt to be, we were not very high on the pecking order. That was an impression people had. Yes.
Budgets were low.
Yes, their budgets were always modest. Yes.
But it was ring fenced.
Yes, that was very important. It was ring fenced. That became a major thread in the story of all of that over the next 10 or 20 years. In 1984, when I became the head of that adult education department, by then called continuing education, the outgoing controller, Donald Grattan, took me aside and pressed into my hands an envelope in which was a photocopy of a minute of the meeting of the governors back in some date in the 1960s, which recorded the governor's decision that the adult education department should continue to have its own ring-fenced funding, and said, I have in the past had to draw current management's attention to this historical document, because to reverse it, any management would have to go back to the governors and have again the debate that we had in 1964 or whatever it was.
How interesting.
Yeah.
Yes, so it was protected.
Yeah, well, it was protected, but yes, it was. But at the same time, the fact that it was protected was a source of growing irritation and annoyance to the general management of BBC television as it went forward. Yeah.
Now it had its own budget. It had its own dedicated slots, effectively.
Yeah.
But what about what it made programmes about?
Yes. Again, at the outset, that was above my pay grade, really. My recollection was that at that time we, as producers, we offered up ideas on the one hand, and a certain number of projects were handed down to us as being things that had to be done.
Right, so channel controllers might make suggestions, but they couldn't actually demand that you made programs about a particular...
I don't know whether that question ever came to the crunch, really. The as it were, semi-instructions reached us via our own controller, who, to some extent, would have been influenced by discussions with the advisory councils that you were alluding to earlier.
Yeah, I think the project that you were most associated with was the adult literacy campaign, which was an enormous campaign. Can you remember? And it was to do with recognising the fact that there were a huge number of people in the country who couldn't read, therefore were functioning badly, and that there were things you could do. But to come up with a campaign that actually provided them with learning materials and so on, and so I mean that was an extraordinary thing to do. So that was, I think, the department's first big project.
Yeah, I think so, yes. It was different in scale from anything that had happened prior to that, yes.
Now, how did you get involved in it?
In a way, it was an example of how that old structure worked well, because the education officers, or some of them, drew to the attention of the management that there was a growing concern in society that there was a social problem relating to low levels of basic education. And I can remember that we used to, well, you will remember as well, that we used to have offers meetings within the department, which people offered up ideas. And I can remember that in, I think, probably 1972 and 1973, our then boss, John Kane, drew to the attention of these meetings that there seemed to be an opportunity stroke need for something to be done in this area, in the hope that some of the producers will say, yes, I'm in, yes, please. But it didn't happen. I mean, it did not happen. The producer body collectively were not quick to seize what now looks like an opportunity.
So how did you get the short straw?
Well, no, I didn't. I was the odd person who put his hand up and said, please, sir, I'd be interested in having a go at that. Partly I had my own background in the production field, had been largely concerned with language teaching programs, which in those days, the sort of convention was that we did a 25 or 30 part semi-dramatized series with related books and so on. And I had done 2 of those. They were quite long form things. I mean, each one of those was 18 months plus work. So I was sort of match fit for doing semi-marathons, as it were. But also I was interested in languages, and once I started hearing about the literacy situation, I got interested in it, began to think this would be an interesting thing to tackle.
Were you surprised that there were so many people in the country who couldn't read?
Oh, yes. Quite early on. Well, I think anybody coming to it now, if we imagine the whole thing playing out now in 2021, anyone would also still be surprised, because at the level of what we might call functional literacy, where can you address an envelope so it will arrive at its destination? Can you read the instructions on a bottle of medicine or a cleaning product so that you do the appropriate thing? I mean, the failure rates for that are still around 20% in all Western industrialized countries.
Really?
That's not a problem exclusive to the United Kingdom. It's still the case. A massive educational failure globally. But yeah, back in 1973-4, when I started hearing about this, there was a group of, a very important group of people who, each of whom worked for one or other, the term was settlement, British Association of Settlements. These were not publicly financed educational endeavours to try and help disadvantaged people, largely in disadvantaged parts of the country. They were right at the coal face. I mean, they were meeting all the time, people with extreme difficulties in literacy and numeracy. And they became very effective agitators for a higher profile for the problem. And in 1973, they had a very well publicised conference, which was called Status Illiterate Prospects Zero. And it got quite a lot of attention. At the same time, in the United States, there was some movement in the same direction towards creating a campaign called Right to Read, which added, well, that gave a bit more zip to the UK variant of it. But in 1973, it was estimated at the worst end of the spectrum, where people wouldn't even know the letter forms,
Yes.
for example, or be able to write their own name. There were perhaps in the UK about 2 million people. It was an estimate, and a rather not terribly solidly founded one, because a very high proportion of the people with that difficulty were concealing it and were too embarrassed to acknowledge it or to seek help. But of those that were seeking help, in the whole UK, there were about 5,000. That's a very small number in relation to the scale of the problem.
So the perceived need amongst educators was that there was a massive need to encourage more people.
Yeah, amongst those educators who engaged mentally with or emotionally with that problem, yes, absolutely. Once the BBC had kind of stepped up to do it, acknowledged that it would be useful to do something, we then had to define what. What became clear to me pretty quickly was that you could not, through broadcasting, you could not deliver increments of reading skill to adults who really didn't have any, not least because it was to a large degree a remedial problem. I mean, pretty well all of the people who would have the problem would have experienced primary and secondary education of some sort in the UK. But for one reason or another, they hadn't acquired useful degree of reading and writing skills, or if they had acquired a little, those skills had quickly atrophied through disuse afterwards. So what you were dealing with was a target audience of people, each of whom had a different problem. I mean, who knows where on the spectrum they had got stuck, or and why. I mean, maybe you got stuck because your eyesight wasn't quite good enough for seeing the board at the front of the classroom. You know, you drew the straw and was sat at the back, and you didn't tell your mum you couldn't quite make it out, and so instruction passed you by, or your hearing wasn't quite up to it, or any of a number of things, or the family situation. Anyway, you couldn't know where an individual was stuck. Thus, you couldn't remediate it by remote medium. Also, a great many people were concealing their difficulty, even within the family sometimes.
So you knew that television couldn't really do anything, as it were, really systematically to incrementally to improve people's reading, but you could at least encourage them to A, recognise that there was a problem, B, recognise that there were facilities in the community for helping them. But were those facilities actually there? No,
they weren't. As I say, only about 5,000 people were receiving any such help. And I think that at least a third, possibly a half of local education authorities were making no such provision. Anyway, I drafted a plan which had many parallel interlocking strands.
Yeah.
But it was based on this perception that we couldn't actually remediate, but what we could do is try and reduce the sense of isolation, try and reduce the stigma a bit, try and perhaps deliver some tiny piece of learning that if you mastered it, you would feel better about yourself and might want to progress. But we also had to acknowledge, even though you needed face-to-face individualized help, you weren't going to get it because there was no one there to give it to you. So the other thing we needed to do was to try and mobilize volunteers who could help with that. So in addition to what the broadcasting we were doing to try and reach the isolated, embarrassed adult, we also needed another strand of programming which preceded it, which sought to create awareness of the scale of the problem, touch the hearts of some of the literate to the point where they were prepared to spend time one-to-one teaching such an adult. To do that, you also had to provide the resources that somebody volunteering could use in order to train themselves to do that.
Yes. massive chicken and egg
Yeah.
problem.
So you had to. There was
yeah.
a sequence. You had to begin with trying to mobilise volunteer tutors. You had to create the resources for volunteer tutors to use, but also you had to get the assent of all of the local education authorities in the country, because once you started broadcasting, trying to encourage people to seek help, a massive demand was, if you did it well, was likely to happen. So we recruited somebody from the British Association of Settlements who had herself been running a literacy scheme in South London called Cambridge House. This is one Jenny Stevens, and she became one of the education officer field force, devoted specifically to this work. And she went to 120 LEAs to have this intense conversation with them, saying the BBC is planning to do this broadcasting in almost a year's time. If it's effective broadcasting, then it will mobilise demand in your area as in every other area. So we need you, A, to agree, and B, to prepare.
What was the role of the government in this? Was there any role at all? I mean,
No.
was the Department of Education
No.
supportive? No?
It was...
This is Mrs. Thatcher's time,
I
isn't
couldn't say, yes, I couldn't say whether it was indifferent or... It certainly wasn't actively supportive or indeed approached, as far as I remember.
Really? Interesting.
No, I don't think so.
Because you were asking, in effect, for resources
Yes,
in the local authorities.
Yeah.
Although it was a volunteer force.
Well,
at least the idea was that it should be a volunteer force.
Well, that was, as it were, second best. I mean, that was Folk to Muir, perhaps, in Burnley or wherever, we can organise some effective volunteer teaching. In the longer term, what we all look for is professional teaching and the resources to accompany that. But as always, resources were limited. So in a local education authority, in order to do more of this, they would have to do less of something else, and so on. So it was a tough call, really. Anyway, Jenny went and saw every single one of these.
That's
and had
amazing.
This hard conversation with all of them. And she would... So she had to explain to them that at the end of each broadcast, it was likely we would put up a telephone number and encourage people to ring it, which would eventually lead them to advice on how to reach their particular local education authority. And she had one or two conversations with LEA officials. Say, well, what if we can't make this provision? And she said, well, and that's straightforward. So we'll make the broadcast say, so if you would like help, please ring 01992 5522, unless you live in Bromley or wherever. So to a degree which is, the propriety of which is questionable, we forced their hands, really, to some degree. So if you were doing
So the plan was that you would produce some programs which would help those who were going to be volunteers, give them some steerage.
Yeah.
Books as well,
Yeah.
Course material, because that's one of the things that,
Yeah.
of course, the education departments were quite strong at producing.
Yeah.
But also you had to get to these people who couldn't read,
Yeah.
and that meant getting out of the ghetto, as it were, in terms of the broadcasting transmission times. So what happened there?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Well, remember, we're talking about people who may very well be deeply embarrassed about the fact they have this difficulty. So we needed to float in front of them the possibility of help, but that couldn't be done with the ghetto times, as you rightly say. So my assistant at the time, Barbara Durko, and I thought, well, the only way we're going to solve this is if we come up with something that is attractive to the general viewer, but contains within itself stuff that is sensitive to the real target audience. And our best chance of doing that and getting it on outside the ghetto times is if it's short. But also, if we're going to make any serious inroads into this huge problem, and we're going to have to abandon the what had up to then been sort of conventions of our educational broadcasting, which was that you did series of 5 or 10, or in the case of the language series, maybe in the 20s. After much, much, much more. Well, we just needed to be doing almost indefinitely. Well, we couldn't commit to doing it indefinitely, but I came up with a plan for doing it for 3 years, in the course of which we would have ongoing parallel research, which would show what might usefully be done thereafter. But in terms of the short programs that would hopefully reach the target, I suggested that we did 52 programs in year 1, which were repeated both several times in the week, but then in its entirety in year 2, and again in year 3. But we also, in the second year, we added in another series which was closer to conventional educational broadcasting, which contained a bit more explicit instruction for people who were encouraged by the first, or indeed were a bit less embarrassed anyway. So a 20-part series in year 2, and another shorter one in year 3, but all turned on getting high exposure for the short one.
Which was called On the Move.
It became On the Move. We thought about this no end, and basically we were trying to create something that the general family audience could enjoy, whether or not there was anyone illiterate in that family. And we came up with a format that was largely dramatised. It was based on the idea that, sort of science fiction idea, that there was a society in which knowledge of reading was restricted to a kind of Uber class, but there was a kind of helot or slave class who didn't have that, but for whom it was the most desirable thing in the world. And if you could find your way of squirreling out a bit of knowledge from the others, that was progress. So we thought we could sort of veil the whole thing or attack it obliquely. Of course, these weren't, although we were conceiving it in a slightly science fiction-y way. I mean, in fact, there was historical precedent for that. I mean, in the American South in the 1850s and so on, it was a criminal offence for slaves to try and learn to read.
Was it?
Yes. In some states it was. So it wasn't an entirely outlandish idea, but we could see it giving suspense and so on. We commissioned a script from a good writer, Terence Dix, and we decided, well, I should have said that we had decided that this is all such unknown territory that we were going to devote a significant part of the money we had to doing a pilot program to test before we fatally or not went on air. And it was a mercy that we did that, because we created this thing. The star was Martin Shaw. It had lots of top flight actors in it. We made it. It was a very polished, I would say it myself, it was a very polished and attractive little program. I would have watched more of them. And John Kane, our then boss, took it along to the then controller of BBC One, who was Brian Cowgill. And Brian Cowgill was now no longer with us, sadly. He was regarded by other broadcasters as a bit of a rough diamond, really, and not an especially or obviously sensitive person. But anyway, he was an honoured and unacknowledged hero of all this, because he said, well, yeah, I like it. What I'll do is I'll put it on Sundays, just before the 6 o'clock news, between the classic family serial and the 6 o'clock news. Well, that was fantastic. What a time. You've got to remember now that we're talking 2021. Back in the mid-70s, there were only 3 channels. There was BBC One, ITV, and BBC Two. But there were two mass audience family channels only. So the audience available after a good drama series on BBC One that was finishing at about 10 to 6 was often well over 10 million.
Yes.
And there was almost, and Brian Cowgill had obviously thought, there's quite a good chance people wouldn't turn off, because you've only got to wait a few minutes till this is over and you've got the news.
Yes.
So it was perfect.
Was this the science fiction-based thing that you've been talking about?
Yes, it was. So then we went out to test this thing. And you could never really test it as you would wish, because you could never gather together a group of people who were not acknowledging that they had a literacy difficulty, all you could do was show it to people who had one and might in the past have been embarrassed about it, but now no longer were, really. So it was never perfect. But anyway, we went to up and down the country, and we would show it first of all to the people who'd been teaching, and then in a separate session to the taught. We thought it would be better because if we showed the two together, we thought the teachers would be so articulate they would dominate the discussion, etc. What happened was there was an almost constant pattern, and that is that the teachers would say, oh, this is great, this is witty, it's sophisticated, no one's insulted by this, it's great. Then later that evening you would show it to another group of people, those who actually had the difficulty, and they hated it. I mean, I don't mean they were ho-hum, they actually hated it.
Really? They thought it was patronising?
They thought it was very, very patronising. It showed no understanding, as they saw it, of their actual situation. It was oblique. It didn't. They plain did not like it.
How very interesting.
They hated it. They hated it. This came as quite a blow.
Bit of a shock, yes.
Quite
absolutely.
A blow. So we went back to went back to the production office. And
Tails between legs.
After weeping and so on, we tried to understand what we had heard.
Had the groups who had rejected it come up with any sort of ideas of the sorts of things they might have liked? I mean, had you got any clue at this point what might take its place?
Well, there was one indicator that was very important, and that is that we had one little piece of testimony that was not in the context of the science fiction drama, but was actually square-on testimony from a lady talking about her life, her real life, and they all liked that. So when we regrouped to think, well, now what? Well, first thing was we were so far off having an acceptable product that we couldn't go to air with that without doing another pilot trip, taking another piece of our limited finance and doing all that again.
Was there any extra money being given to you for this? I mean, the department had a limited total budget. This sounded quite an expensive procedure.
Well, it wasn't that expensive in terms of the actual production, because I had a discussion at the very outset. The then manager or administrator of the department said, well, David, I'm told you're going to be doing this. What are we talking about? And I said, well, we plain don't know. But in common sense terms, perhaps you could block it in as being equivalent to one of the language teaching series that we regularly do. I mean, I don't know what it's going to be. I truly don't know. But that might give us some kind of a handle on it from a resource point of view. So it was budgeted at that level, not a level outside the norms for educational broadcasting. But instead of doing 25 half-hour programs, we were going to be doing 52 10-minute ones of an unknown nature.
Okay, so you had to rethink.
Yeah, we rethought, and it was clear that this drama vehicle hadn't worked at all, and we needed some more explicit elements than we had initially thought, and we needed more of this sort of testimony. So we came up with another version, or the two of us, Barbara and I. We couldn't get away from the fact that we still had to create something that was entertaining for the mass audience. Otherwise, there was no way it was going to be transmitted in this kind of time. So we still felt the need for some sort of fictional and entertaining
but perhaps rooted in real day-to-day life.
Well, that would have been a good conclusion to have drawn, but I'm afraid we didn't. We were still, I suppose, so locked in our love for what we had done but the public had rejected, that we came up with something that, with hindsight, was all too close to what we'd done the first time. We raised the stakes by employing an even more high-profile writer, Faye Weldon, and we also thought that in order to deal somehow more explicitly with instructional points, we also got in touch with Barry Took, well-known, very high-caliber comedy writer, essentially. So the second version contained another drama vehicle, a bit less outlandish than the first, written by Faye Weldon, and some some entertainment elements written by Barry Took, and again a little bit of film testimony. The film testimony was very hard to acquire because it's very hard to find anyone willing to talk on camera about this. So we came up with version 2. We went out on the road again with that, and whereas when we went out with the first one, we were lucky to get out of the room with our skin. Going out with the second, seriously, people were angry with us. The second version, we were more or less just told to leave the room. I mean, it was still not right at all.
Really?
No, it was not right at all. Meanwhile, I have Faye Weldon working away with the target of arriving at 52 scripts.
Terrible. Sorry, what was the nature of the sketches or the dramas, the little dramas you were producing this time? I mean, it was a science fiction sort of thing the first time.
Yes. Well, the second one was well, I'm ashamed to say it was also a kind of science fiction. I've managed to erase from my mind some of it, but it was also a less than credible situation.
So was that do you think that was the fundamental problem, that it was so fictional that people couldn't identify with it?
Yeah. I think that was essentially it.
Okay.
Well, then we came to what for me as a producer was the crisis of all crises, and that was that I came to the conclusion that we just couldn't continue with this fictional frame that I had envisaged. So what we agreed with Barry Took was that we would, instead of the overarching, in quotes, story that we had been envisaging, what we would do is have something more like a Greek chorus, a kind of way of commenting on educational points explicitly. We came up with the idea of Barry writing ongoing linking material that was based on two men talking to each other, and either he or I, and I can't remember which now, came up with the idea that they should be removal men, because removal men can go into any situation, they can handle anything. So if you would, I don't know, if in that program you were being concerned with the letter P or something, you know, they could curse the weight of the piano or and so forth. And another beauty of them being removal men is they travelled around a lot in a van, and in the van there were possibly more intimate conversations between two, almost confessional conversations.
So one could read and the other couldn't.
Yeah, one could. One was bouncy, cocky alpha male who could not read and was concealing that, and the other was a quiet, less alpha fellow who could read but was tactful and helpful in these conversations. And Bob Hoskins was cast as Alf, the non-reader, so he was in effect the centre of the show. But while we had this idea, which seemed to get us onto firmer ground, I still had this situation. I had the ugly situation where I had to get in touch with Faye Weldon and tell her that the 30 scripts she'd written were, I'm afraid, not going to be used, although they would, of course, be paid for. I then had to get onto artist contracts and say to them, well, look, the people that we had hoped would be in this second drama vehicle, there isn't going to be one. And you will remember when I asked you to contract them for the second pilot, you had to make clear to them that there was no guarantee that it would ever go beyond that. Well, so when I said to him, look, I'm sorry, but Martin Shaw isn't going to be doing 52 episodes because we aren't doing that anymore. And then she said, well, but David, I've contracted him. I said, well, no, Anna, because I explained to you that we were only contracting for the pilot with no guarantee beyond that. She said, no, I'm afraid they all have the understanding that we're going on for 52 episodes. And I say, well, we aren't doing that. And she said, well, I'm sorry, but they're contracted and they'll have to be paid for that. So after crying, whatever I did, I can't remember. I had sat down again with Barry Took and Barbara. We said, well, look, we've got half a dozen top flight actors. We've got Martin Shaw, Polly Jade, Rosemary Leach, Nigel Stock, Pat Hayes. These are some of them. Oh, these are absolute top flight actors. Yes. We've got them. So what can we do? And without going back to the ongoing stories that we know don't work. So Barry said, well, look, what we could do is I can try and create sketches or perhaps songs or little sequences that bear upon the letter or the word that we're trying to familiarize people with, and see if we can use their contribution that way. So I went back to the artist contracts department and said, look, and explained that. And she said, well, we can try, but we have no right. You know, they want to be in a script by Fay Weldon, etc. Anyway, so she had to go back and talk to each of these artists and see whether they could consider that, which in the end, all but one of them did.
Barry, I mean, was a very funny man. He was he was on, I forget what comedy programs he'd written for, but also he appeared himself, didn't he? I mean, he was
sometimes
he was very, very.
He was more of a writer than a performer, but yes.
Yeah, but what had he written for?
Well, his most famous work was Round the Horn.
Ah, yes.
But he did a lot of other things with Marty Feldman. He was an immensely experienced writer.
Yeah. So you had a superb collection of actors who had their arms twisted, but you had your main protagonists, as it were.
Yeah.
And presumably, as they moved around as removal men, they would meet these other characters.
Well, no, we didn't do that actually. What we did was partly because of the history of how, what we call them, the supernumerary, so they were very distinguished ones. Well, they had been contracted to do the vehicle story in one bout of recordings, quite concentrated. So we had them for, I don't know, might have been half a dozen studio days in which we recorded all kinds of songs, sketches and so on. So we had a kind of bank of that sort of material. And then we shot Alf and Bert out and about in the removal van. Meanwhile, desperately struggling, try and find people who will give us individual testimony of their own experience of all this. So when we came close to transmission dates, we hadn't got a program. Well, we got a lot of elements. I mean, we had a template for how they would fit together, but we hadn't actually fitted them together. So there were recordings then, which ran most of the way through the transmission year, in which just before the transmission we assembled the elements. And the reason we kept doing it like that is we had an absolute paucity of testimony, and yet the testimony was, on the face of it, probably the most potent thing we could present.
Yes, having people who admitted they couldn't.
Yeah. And we used the supernumeraries. We used their terrific qualities to do to camera pitch on Why Don't You Ring, This Is Number. Very high, I mean, they bring tears to your eyes, some of those. After the testimony, they would say, look, millions have got difficulty with reading or writing for some reason or other. It's nothing to be ashamed of. And you can get help, It was that.
Yes.
It was better expressed than that. But they each did those pieces to camera, which led directly to the presentation of the phone number. So we probably put the first program together a few days before the transmission, and then we were living hand to mouth for a long, long while. Eventually, as the program got a profile and began to have some impact, more people were willing to be interviewed to give testimony. So it began to get easier to get that.
And who was finding these people? The education officers?
Indirectly, yes. I mean, they were in touch with people running literacy schemes, desperately trying to get them to nominate somebody who would be prepared to be interviewed about this.
At this point, of course, you would want to cue a clip. So can you tell me how a typical On the Move programme was structured then? I mean, perhaps there wasn't a typical one, but what kind of things would you have in a quarter of an hour?
The programmes were 9.5 minutes.
9.5 minutes.
And they would begin with the generic titles, which was the van moving along a road. It had we'd gone quite a lot of trouble to try and create visuals that would give the whole thing some higher profile. So it was a vehicle which had a big arrow on it. We had created a theme song, and we had made efforts to try and get this placed on Radio 1 and the like.
Oh, really?
So it would begin with this musical introduction. Then you would typically cut to inside the removal van, and they would Alf and Bert would be talking about, I don't know, I mean,
Football
either where they were
results or
going
something,
to,
yes.
or football or something or other, and indirectly the matter of why some words were written this way and sounded another way would come up. Then there might be a sketch, not involving them, but involving
Some of your other actors,
some of the other stars, and an animation. Then we might go back to a bit more of Alf and Bert now in situ in some venue where the teaching point was a bit more exposed, and then perhaps, if we had it, the piece of testimony, then the to-camera invitation to ring in from Rosemary Leach or whoever it would be, and that would be it.
That's interesting.
And there were no end credits. There were no credits of any kind because we thought it was insulting. Yeah, we thought it was insulting to somebody you've been tiptoeing around their sensibilities. It's really stupid to.
Perhaps you were anticipating what happens nowadays when the end credits disappear.
Yeah. In a way, yes. Anyway, I don't think anyone missed the end credits.
Only the people working on
but we didn't have any of that.
No.
One thread in it I haven't mentioned, which played a part in making it attractive to the family audience, was there was quite a lot of animation. Whilst the cock-up about the contracting of all these actors and scripts that we didn't use lurks in my mind as one of my worst failures as a producer. The matter of the animation, it sticks in my mind as one of my better strokes, because we didn't have a lot of money, and it was obvious to me that the show needed a lot of animation, good entertaining animation. Now, a couple of years before our story began, I had worked with one of my colleagues, Anna Jackson, on a program called the Do-It-Yourself Animation Show.
Oh, yes.
In which, as the title suggests, it showed you how you could make little animated films yourself. And it had world-class animators involved, like Bob Godfrey, for example. But it also had contributions from all kinds of other animators, illustrating various points. And one of them was a guy who was in his last year at the Royal College of Art, one Ted Rockley. And the things he was contributing to the Do-It-Yourself Animation Show, I was really, really impressed by. And it came to me, rather than trying to spend my limited money commissioning animation through BBC Graphics Department, maybe I could actually hire Ted Rockley to come and work for me. And he would actually work full-time for me. He'd make his animations at home on his equipment like he already did as a student. And I would have a year's worth of him. So I went to the graphics department and nervously saying that I wanted to do this. And was I going to provoke civil war or industrial action? But they looked at the then head of graphics, looked at the quality of the student stuff, and he said, "Well, this is so good, we'll just look the other way. You just do it." So that's what we did. I put him on a salary, and he was my boy, and we rang him up and told him what we needed, and he came back with the most brilliantly imaginative and accomplished work. It lifted the whole thing enormously.
So you have these short programs, 9.5 minutes or whatever it was, going out. At the end, there's an appeal. What was the response in the country?
Well, it was very strong. I mean, it was, for me, very, very emotional. I went, for the first program, I went to the place where the telephone calls were coming in. I sat myself down, and so I too would be one of the people taking the calls. And we came to the end, and suddenly all the lights on all the telephones lit up. I mean, it was just, there were 20 lines, which is not a lot in terms of what we would understand now, but in terms of what we were able to organise at the time, that was quite a lot.
These were 20 lines coming into Television Centre, were they?
Well, they were not.
They weren't regional.
No, they were coming into a centre. It wasn't Television Centre.
Right.
But yeah, they were coming in there. They were also coming into smaller regional centres, but that was more difficult because to achieve that, the regions had to opt out of the telephone plug in order to insert their number. But anyway, so suddenly there were people and kept ringing. I can't give you the numbers, but
that must have been a huge relief.
Oh, it was enormous relief. Of course, you could never know about the people who weren't ringing, who might still have hated the programme. But yeah, it was. The help that we were able to give them was quite impressive, really, because we had built up details of who the contact point was in every LEA in the country. It's not always straightforward, because sometimes even the same street may cross from one LEA into another, you know. But basically, when the person rang up, there would be a kind of drill in which we would say, well, yeah, are you able to give me your name? Do you have a phone number yourself? Forgive me asking, but do other people in your household know about you making this call? Would you be embarrassed if somebody rang you back? And trying to get some sort of picture of who the person was briefly. And then in the quieter downtimes, this information would get sorted and relayed out to whatever seemed to be the right person in the right LEA.
But I mean, you're passing the names on to the people who are going to help them.
Well, yes, not directly to them, but to those organising that. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And then how were they allocated? How does that? You just matched up somebody as close as possible to the person that was in need.
That's what they would. That's what they would do, depending on their ability, their resources, and the number of people they'd got, and everything else.
And the materials that they were using in their presumably sort of one-to-one meetings with these people, these were provided.
Well, we had created materials. Itself another story, because how do you create a book for somebody who can't read at all, etc. But no, that would be their judgment. I mean, what to work with. But we had created some materials, yes.
And was that BBC Publications or what?
Yes, yes, it was. We also created, for the learner, material which we gave away. The material relating to each programme was also available as a sort of individual sheet, which we had piles of them in supermarkets and churches and doctors' waiting rooms, etc., etc. So you could just pick it up and take it.
Now, what was the nature of that? Because they couldn't read.
No, well, no, exactly. But it gave you things that made you familiar with the letter form that we've been talking about in the programme. Maybe something that helped you trace the letter, writing it yourself. Examples of it in social sight words that were around you in the environment. That sort of thing.
That was immensely complicated, because these things were tied to individual programmes and then had to be got out into the... Wow.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
And how was that organised? Was that organised on a local level, or was it centrally distributed? How... I'm just thinking.
My memory is failing me a little bit on that.
It's such an enormous project, this.
Yeah, it was. Yes. Well, I suppose that the education officers would have talked to. I don't know. I'll invent this. You know, say Tesco, and Tesco would have agreed to, in the week beginning such and such a date, to have piles of this document there, and local education authorities would have done the same.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Now, tell us the results. You come to the end of the first year.
Well, certainly by the end of the first year, the numbers of people receiving some sort of instruction, which had been at the level of about 5,000, you were now certainly up in the area of 200,000 or more. Quite how much of that was directly attributable to the programmes, I can't say, because there was a general attempt by the British Association of Settlements to run this Right to Read campaign, in which they too were trying to create a climate in which people could come forward. So picking those things apart would be very, very difficult, if not impossible. But we'd gone from the low single-digit thousands up into the treble-digit thousands by the end of a year.
Because I heard, it's just received wisdom from the department, I suppose, when I was working there later, that about 2 million people overall were helped to read.
Well, in the 3 years, that might well be true, yes. I couldn't vouch for that, but it had moved by an enormous order of magnitude. One handle you have on it is how many people actually got face-to-face help. But you also would ideally like to know how many people's attitudes had changed.
Yes.
In such a way that at some point they would seek help, or indeed, if they were a normally literate person, they would be more sympathetic to people who didn't have that level of skill.
Yeah, yeah.
So difficult to measure those things.
Indeed. I suppose in a way the American Sesame Street was a sort of similar kind of attempt to get, well, admittedly younger people, but presumably...
Yeah, that was a
I don't know, were there any other adult
they had
initiatives around the world that took this as a model?
Afterwards, yes. Before it, there had been in Italy a small-scale use of broadcasting to try and help poor readers, but nothing like this scale. But afterwards, yes, indeed, there were several attempts that followed the thinking of this, and I was involved with several of them actually, particularly in America. What you came to realise quite quickly is how well suited to this our broadcasting setup was, because at least 50% of the television viewing audience of whatever level of education were likely to be watching BBC One at some point. I mean, since then, there's been this splintering of channels. So, for example, I worked with the Americans on trying to see how they might approach this, yes. And the people with whom it was most natural to work were PBS, but PBS didn't, normally speaking, have access to the audience you really wished to speak to.
No.
So there you needed to work with two broadcasters, one of them a major network, yeah. and the other PBS. Well, that was done, but it wasn't as coherent or effective an effort as ours. And what I haven't talked about at all is that in addition to what we were ourselves doing and generating out of our production offices in television and radio, is that we were all the time trying to persuade our colleagues in making other programs to publicise this effort and in their own way to address the same aim. So the Jimmy Young programme embraced it and did a lot that helped. I went to see Brian Wenham, who was then the head of current affairs television, and told him what we were aiming to do. And he's a pretty hard-bitten fellow. And I made my probably over-the-top emotional pitch to him, and he said to me, well, I never tell my producers what to do, but on this occasion I will. And he was as good as his word. There was a panorama generated about the whole issue, which had some impact on the volunteering to teach. And Nationwide also did programming that addressed it. And similarly, throughout the BBC, the BBC sort of collectively embraced it, a sort of collective effort. But, I mean, the real heroes of it, of the whole thing, really, were the people who actually delivered the face-to-face teaching at the end of the day. So it was never really rightly described as the BBC Adult Literacy Campaign. It was the better word is project that described our contribution. But meanwhile, the Association of Settlements and others were beating the drum up and down the country, and people were giving up their time to try and help other people.
And how long did the whole effect last? Has it tailed off? Is it still going?
Well, its profile lowered because one of the things that became apparent and was foreseeable really was that some parts of the country or some LEAs coped better than others. And it was a terrible problem, you know. I mean, if you were in Warrington, say, and you'd been running a literacy class each week for which 7 people came, and you were very proud of helping them, on Monday, the LEA, spurred by the BBC, would say, well, look, we've had 27 people want to be in touch with you. So next Sunday, another 36 people have come, and so on. I mean, and we were doing this for 3 years, every week for 3 years. And so the demand placed upon the provider was enormous, and there was no way for them stopping it.
No, but the local authorities presumably thought this is important, social service writ large, isn't it? So presumably they supported it.
Yes, some more warmly, but they were up against a tremendous resource problem, not just money, but people,
Of course.
human beings who would actually come and do this.
Would this largely have been managed in local authorities within, say, the adult education departments?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Rather than further education or whatever.
I can't speak with much authority about that.
No.
But what became clear was that by the end of the 3 years, and you remember that we had also commissioned research to run in parallel to see what should guide the BBC in the future in all of this. What became clear is that some provision centres couldn't cope. I mean, and we were making the situation. In the worst case, we're making the situation worse. And now we put you in touch with your what's an appropriate person in South Shields or wherever it might be. And then they say, well, we hear you, but actually we can't help at the moment. We can't help because we haven't got the people or the resources. So then you might well be driven further back into your isolation than you were in the beginning. So this was playing out, all these things playing out in the running into the late 70s. And in 1984, I became the head of that department. And there was nothing I wanted more to do than do more of this. But it became clear that it was irresponsible to do it in anything like the form we had done it. Because of the varying capacity of LEAs around the country to actually cope with it. I mean, they actually did not want you to do it. They couldn't. You were actually creating situations that were worse. So, and by now there was a national agency that could tell you that had been born in the course of all of this, and there was an agency that had the authority to speak at a national level to the BBC about it. And their clear advice was, no, you must not call more people forward in anything like the way and the number that you have previously done, because it can't be coped with. What you must do is continue providing on a smaller scale learning resources. So we did. But simply replicating what we had done before would not have been responsible.
Really?
And I think that if this were all to play out again now, that's probably the advice you'd still get.
What would you do nowadays, given the other resources that exist, the internet and so on?
Well, I don't know. That's
YouTube.
I don't know.
No, it's interesting, isn't it?
And the whole broadcasting media environment's changed.
Completely changed.
So totally that I suppose you would try and nudge people towards something they could watch on their phone or in privacy, or some routes that weren't obvious to other people.
But the need is still there.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not sure if there are any data on the stigma factor and the need to conceal factor. I'm not sure whether a social scientist could tell you about that. But the degree of undereducation of adults at a basic level absolutely continues.
So, I mean, it's a bit of a downer at the end, isn't it? Because of this effect you said. But I mean, at the time, you presumably thought of this as a great success.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no,
I hope you got sufficient credit for it.
Yes, well, we did. We got, these gongs don't matter much really, but as television professionals, we were very pleased. We got, Television Society Awards for the most original programme, and we got BAFTA Award for the best specialised programme. But at an institutional level, we got a UNESCO Award.
Did you?
Yeah, and there was another international prize I can't just remember the name of this minute.
A PS, David.
Yeah, well, I'd just like to say that anyone who's seriously interested in this and what could be learnt from it, better than my rambling account, is a book that I wrote, which is called Adult Literacy and Broadcasting, which contains within itself a month-by-month diary of how things transpired. Fairly candid one, actually, in which I confess our confusion and mistakes, but also tries to extrapolate from it all what lessons there might be. It also presents the findings of the research that the BBC commissioned with the National Institute of Adult Education on the whole thing. Also, for the serious student of broadcasting and its errors and successes, The University of Lancaster in the early 90s did a big study on what had been done in adult basic education in the UK in the 70s and 80s, including what broadcasters had contributed. And so that contains views about the efficacy of what we did and where we could have done better.
But on the whole, the efficacy was considerable.
The impact was considerable.
Yeah.
Whether it could have been more or better is for others to judge.
Well, it's a fantastic story. It really is. I mean, David, thank you very much for talking.